welcome everybody to our webinar for parents and carers, all about ADHD and support at school. We'll be talking about your children's rights. We'll introduce ourselves first of all. So my name is Beth. I'm an Advice and Information Officer at Enquire. Been with Enquire for a couple of years now. Before that, I used to work in high schools and I worked with children with additional support needs as a teaching assistant. And yeah, I'm here with Hannah, who is my colleague from Enquire. Hannah, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Hannah. I'm a Senior Advice and Information Officer at Enquire. I've been at Enquire for 8.5 years, but before that, I worked with adults with learning difficulties and the Scottish Government and policy. And before that, I was a young person who needed quite a lot of additional support at school, did all my exams in hospital. So this is always, it's always been a topic area that's close to my heart. And I'll pass on to Geraldine as well.
Hi everyone, I'm Geraldine Miners. I was the first chair of the Scottish ADHD Coalition, which we'll tell you a bit more about. But I also run an ADHD group here in Glasgow, ADHD Parent Support West Glasgow. I've also worked with families over many years. I'm a CBT therapist and I have a son with ADHD who thankfully is no longer at school.
Thanks, Geraldine. We are also joined by Mohit, one of our other colleagues. He's going to be behind the scenes and in the chat. So if you see comments from Mohit or links that he's sending from the Enquire website, they're the ones to click. He's going to hopefully keep in touch with what we're talking about. So if anything we mention should come up in the chat as well. Right, shall we get going?
Yeah, get going. As I said, thank you all so much for joining us this evening. Very briefly, hopefully you might have heard of Enquire since you've found this webinar, but we are the Scottish Advice Service for Additional Support for Learning and have existed for more than 25 years, I think, 20 years. I think we're about to come up for our 25th birthday. We're funded by the Scottish Government to provide independent advice and information to children and young people, parents and carers like yourselves, and professionals about children's rights and the legislation related to additional support for learning. And as you can see, our vision is that all children in Scotland are supported, included, and listened to throughout their education. Now, sorry, I thought there was...
I'm up next. So just to tell you a little bit about how we can help you at Enquire, there's lots of different ways that we can do that. Obviously, you've already found our outreach. We do lots of different webinars on lots of different topics, and we have some lunchtime listen sessions during the day as well. But our main port of call for helping people is our helpline services. We've got a phone, we've got a web chat, and we've got web forms. You can also email us. So if you've got a specific question about your child's rights, that is the best way to get in touch. You'd speak with myself or one of the other advisor team members. We'd talk you through what your child's rights are, and we'd give you some advice about your specific situation. With that in mind, before we go any further, we're not accepting questions today. What we've done is we've prepared some questions based on the sorts of things that we hear from families of children with ADHD on the helpline. It is something that we hear about quite often. So we've based our advice today on the things that come up quite a lot for us on the helpline. If you do have a more specific question that we don't answer, then please do get in touch with our helpline services. And just to bear in mind that that chat function is available to everybody. We can all see it. So please don't name your child, any teachers, any schools, anything like that. And keep things anonymous if you are going to post anything in there. I'll pass over to Geraldine to just do a little bit of an introduction to the Scottish ADHD Coalition.
Yeah, so the Scottish ADHD Coalition was set up in 2017 to bring together all the different organisations in Scotland that are supporting both adults with ADHD and parents of young people with ADHD. And at the moment, it's just a virtual organisation, so it doesn't have any infrastructure as such. It's really its members coming together. So there are three big parent support groups in Scotland, I would say. There's one in Dundee and Angus. There's one in Perth and Kinross, and there's the one in West Glasgow, which I run along with a number of other parents. And it's a shame that there aren't more parent support groups, that there's a real need for them out there. But I would say that our Glasgow group is very much open to anyone. So if you want to come along to our website, it's adhdglasgow.org. And even if you can't make our meetings, there's lots of information on our website about ADHD, and we do run virtual sessions every month. We've got one coming up on Friday, actually, introducing people to ADHD. So the aim of the coalition really is so that we can speak with one voice and hopefully influence government policy as well around ADHD.
Fantastic. And thank you, Geraldine, and thank you so much for joining us today. It just really adds, you know, here at Enquire we can give advice and information around rights and support, but actually having that insight into, and Geraldine's going to continue, is going to contribute today with some sort of ideas of different types of support, and that's really valuable and really adds to this. So thank you so much for coming along, Geraldine. So as I said, the aim of today is to help you as parents to build your understanding of learning so that you can hopefully work with the school to get your child the support they need. So to help you do that, we'll cover the laws and guidance around additional support for learning. There's a lot, but the key things to know we'll cover here so that you've got that grounding for when you go to speak to the school. We'll also talk about the types of support that may help, and that's what we've got Geraldine here to do as well. And we'll also suggest some ways you can work with the school or steps you can take if you need to take things further. As Beth mentioned, the session's been really popular, so rather than doing sort of open Q&A at the end, so that where unfortunately I don't think we've managed to answer 100 people's questions in an hour, despite how skilled Beth is, that would be a bit full on. So we've focused on kind of some of the key questions that we hear and themes on the helpline. So hopefully that gives you a starting point for any of the kind of issues that you might have come here with or might want some more information on. You are welcome to still comment with kind of key themes, and we will try and kind of cover those if they come up in the comments, but that's kind of the way we're going to work today. And just as Beth said, just a reminder not to mention any names of individual schools or teachers or pupils, just to protect everyone's privacy.
So before we go any further, what we wanted to do is get a sort of understanding of where everybody is at the moment, how they're feeling about it, how you as parents are feeling in your understanding. So we're going to ask this question now, and we're going to ask it again at the end. And hopefully by the end of the session, you'll be feeling more confident. But the first question, Hannah's going to pop up a poll. It should just appear on the page now. How confident do you feel in your understanding?
I pressed the wrong button, Beth. I've gone for the end of webinar poll, which is very wonderful. I will start the start of webinar one, which
yes, start of webinar would be good. It's been very quickly if we're finished already.
Yeah.
So how confident do you feel in your understanding of your child's rights to support at school? It's an anonymous vote. Just tick what you feel. We won't know who said what. It's just so that we get a sense of where people are starting out. And then hopefully by the end, you'll have moved up a rung or two and be feeling more confident.
Great, I think that's almost everyone. I'll just give one more moment. I know if you're watching on your phone or something, it can be a bit of a faff trying to do that at the same time. But well, that's up to 96 of 108 of us. So I'll end the poll there. But I think there's a mix of mostly people feeling not very confident and a few of you feeling confident. So thank you very much for feeding that back to us. There you go. That's
there we can see the results.
Yeah. And right. I think Beth, would you be able to take this slide? Just
yeah, of course. So we figured the best place to start when we're talking about additional support for learning is what that definition is. What are we talking about when we talk about additional support needs and additional support for learning? In the additional support for learning legislation, it says a child has additional support needs where for whatever reason they can't benefit from school education without extra help. So you don't need a diagnosis for that to apply. Doesn't need to be a specific condition even. Basically, if there's a reason why your child is struggling at school, then that is an additional support need and they should get some support with that. So as you can see here, this is just a few examples of what some of those additional support needs can be. The law covers everything. Really, it's anything that's having an impact. So that could be things that are having an impact academically, but it could also be things that are happening at home, social and emotional needs, basically anything that's going on that's going to impact how your child is getting on at school can be considered an additional support need. And if they need help with that, then they should get some help with that. It's also important to remember. Oh, sorry, Hannah.
Oh, sorry, Beth, I was just going to add, sorry, I was having a wee bit of tech issues there, but yeah, so that kind of first definition, I think I went through a bit quickly when I was pressing the buttons, but just as Beth said, that, you know, your child has a right to support for whatever reason. And yeah, as Beth was just going on to say, that's kind of very clear in the law. So your child doesn't need that diagnosis. And there are lots of different reasons why they might need support.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'll let you continue, Beth.
No, that's all right. I was going to say it's also important to think about the fact that for a lot of children, it won't just be one thing that's going to impact their education. And we know certainly from what we hear on the helpline that ADHD has lots of different ways that it presents itself, but also can be sort of comorbid with other things as well. So if ADHD is causing mental health issues, or if your child's being bullied because of their ADHD, or really completely separate from ADHD, if things are happening at home or there's something else going on, understanding and recognizing that more than one thing can be happening or being experienced by your child, all of those things should count as additional support needs, and they should get support with all of those things, no matter how many different things there are, I suppose. So the next slide goes on to talk about the duties of the local authority. So this law all applies if your child's at a local authority school, and what the law says is that the local authority must make adequate and efficient provision to support children and young people with additional support needs to help them do the best that they can at school. What that means in practice is that local authorities need to identify what a child or young person's needs are, plan their support, and then keep that support under review. The law doesn't say exactly what support should look like, only that it should be adequate and efficient. But they need to identify what those needs are, plan it, and then keep it under review. So when we're talking about providing that support, there's lots of things that it could be. So if you go to the next slide, Hannah, you'll see just a selection of things that it might include. So this is by no means exhaustive, but just some of the things that we hear about that we know happen at school that can be helpful for lots of people for lots of different reasons. Support's supposed to be based on your child's individual needs. So when you're talking with school and building that support plan, it should be about your child, what their needs are, and what's going to help them the best. You know, for some children, one support will work really, really well. For another child, even with the same diagnosed condition or even with the same home experiences, the support that they need might be very different. And what's important is that you and the school and your child as well, because they've got the right to have their views heard in all of this planning, is that whatever the support plan that's being built, it should be built for them and their needs and what's going to work best for them. Is there anything you would add to that, Hannah?
No, I think only that, and as I'm sure Geraldine will go on to say, is like you'll see some of these supports are actually things that can happen quite quickly, and aren't kind of huge, you know, you're not asking for the world. And I think that's, you know, sometimes the smallest change can make the biggest difference. And, you know, I think that's sometimes where it's really helpful to see that, you know, there are things that, you know, you might feel might be the answer and are kind of bigger things that, can change whether that's kind of one-to-one support or some sort of funding that you might be waiting for. But actually there's also quite a lot of kind of smaller things the school can just do that, you know, could be the things that make a huge difference, or can kind of reflect things that you're doing at home that actually work really well for your child. So I think that's kind of where the, you know, that having that conversation with the school, which we'll go on to, can really help to see, you know, that what you can do is really flexible.
Yeah, definitely. With that in mind, at Enquire, we provide sort of broad support about what the law says and what the guidance says about providing support. We are not particular experts on ADHD, although it is something that we talk about and hear about a lot. So we're very grateful that Geraldine is now going to go on to tell us more specifically what the Scottish ADHD Coalition know about ADHD in particular, and the sorts of things that might help your child with those needs. So over to you, Geraldine.
Okay, great. So yeah, so what sort of adjustments could actually help children with ADHD in the classroom? Well, obviously it's going to depend very much on your individual child and also the stage that they're at, because the kind of supports you might see in primary are probably a bit different from what you might have in a secondary school environment. But in all cases, we're really trying to make up for the fact that kids with ADHD have these 3 core symptoms. So the first symptom of ADHD is inattention. So they've got a very poor short-term memory, usually find it difficult to remember the instructions that they're given, and to stick with a task and not fall off the railway tracks, as it were, halfway through. The second core symptom of ADHD is impulsiveness. So doing things without thinking it through, and that could include in the classroom things like getting up and walking around, or blurting things out without asking permission, lashing out at someone that's winding them up or annoying them in the classroom environment, and so on. And then the third core symptom of ADHD is hyperactivity. And so again, in a classroom environment, that may mean that a child finds it really quite difficult, almost painful, to sit still through a long period of listening and doing something without moving about. And that is often very much connected into sensory issues, which affect most kids with ADHD, I would say. As you probably know, there is also the inattentive form of ADHD, which doesn't include hyperactivity, and that tends to affect girls more than boys. But whatever, if your child's got ADHD, they're going to be inattentive and they're going to be impulsive. So what's going to help them in the classroom? So actually, Hannah, if you might be able to just reveal all the bullet points on this slide, I'll just talk about them all. So these are just examples, and as Hannah and Beth were saying before, none of these things are particularly expensive or difficult, and in fact the things that help kids with ADHD are actually pretty helpful for all kids. So you're not asking for something totally out of the ordinary that's going to be special and different. But some of the things that could be good, first of all, positioning the child in the right place in the classroom. So that can take a bit of thinking about. So it may mean putting them closer to the teacher, so they're not away off in the back where they get easily distracted. It might be about thinking about who they're sitting next to and putting them next to somebody who's a role model or a hard worker, and certainly not someone that they're going to clash with. Then there's warning kids about transitions coming up and changes to routine. Children with ADHD will find it quite difficult to keep track of time. They often have a very poor sense of what does half an hour feel like? What does an hour feel like? And sudden requests to do something different, especially if they're very zoned into a task, can cause a lot of anxiety. So warning kids what's coming up today, what's going to happen next, how long is it going to be, that kind of idea of now and next, which you get a lot of the time in primary school. Always for the child to know what's now and what's next is helpful. Then giving out tasks in bite-sized chunks with really specific instructions. So that can help a lot with the inattentiveness. Because if you just verbally tell a child with ADHD to go away and do 3 things, they'll probably do the first one, but by the time they finish that first one, they've completely forgotten what the second one and the third one was. So giving written instructions, giving 1 step at a time, giving really specific instructions is useful. Letting kids move around and have breaks with exercise really helps with concentration. So things like visual prompts and memory aids. So, for example, helping kids to have a really good homework diary so that they know what they've got to do when they get home. A lot of kids don't write anything in their homework diary. So it might be for a child with ADHD that the teacher actually writes something in for them so that when they get home, they know what they've got to do. Or having written routines. Just as perhaps at home you might do for a child with ADHD to say, what are the 5 things you need to do before you get out of the door in the morning? Also at school, it can be useful to have written routines for, say, what do you need to do to pack up your bag to go home, for example. One-to-one attention can be helpful, potentially a learning support assistant to spend time with a child, just helping them to focus, giving them that extra bit of stimulation that will keep them on track. That, of course, is one that does have a cost implication and isn't always possible for schools to provide. But even if it's just for part of the day, part of the week, it could be good. The next one is a huge bee in my bonnet, because I've seen firsthand how much difference this can make to kids. So a huge number of kids with ADHD have other kinds of neurodevelopmental problems as well. And that may include dyslexia and also dyspraxia, where they find fine motor coordination difficult. So that will make handwriting really, really challenging. And I've seen numerous kids where, when they've learnt to type and they've been allowed to use a laptop at school, suddenly their productivity just rockets, and you get to see their full potential, because they're suddenly able to write down and put on paper everything that they've been thinking about. So that's one that's really, really worth fighting for if that applies to your child and handwriting is difficult. And I think the last couple are really about building kids' self-esteem, because I think children with ADHD tend to get told off a lot at school, and often they end up feeling like they're stupid, or they're not able to do very much, or they're a nuisance, which is really sad, because they have such enormous talents and strengths. They need to be nurtured. So if school can find something that the child excels at and nurtures that will make a huge difference to their self-confidence and their self-esteem, and really make them want to go to school. Might even be giving them a job. I remember my own son, when he was about 7, his class teacher gave him this job as the IT monitor, which was a completely made up job. It had never existed before, but he had to come in and turn on the PC in the morning and get it all ready for the teacher. And he was just so buoyed up by having this task to do, when normally he was just told he was being a pain in the neck. It made a massive difference. And conversely, if a child is finding a particular subject impossibly difficult, and I'm thinking particularly about languages, a lot of kids with ADHD and dyslexia will find languages quite difficult. Maybe it's not worth flogging those things in secondary school, and actually saying, okay, let's hone down the range of subjects to things that my child's going to excel at and do well at. And then lastly, just more tolerance. This is a word to teachers, but more tolerance, particularly around things like fidgeting or sensory stimming, using fidget toys and that sort of thing. So I'll talk a bit more about sensory issues just now, because they are really key here. So So as you may be aware, children with ADHD are very often either very sensitive through all of their different senses, or they may be not sensitive enough and they're seeking out stimulation because their brain is wanting more sensory input. And that applies to sight, touch, taste, smell, hearing, but also internal senses like your vestibular sense, which is your sense of balance, and interoception, which is your sense of knowing whether you're hungry, thirsty, what you're feeling, whether you're tired, etc. So all of these can be affected in ADHD, and it can come through in the classroom. So kids who are kind of craving more stimulation, we need to find ways for them to get that in the classroom, whilst causing minimal aggro to everyone else around them. But if they can get that extra stimulation, it will massively help them to concentrate, just enormously so. So things like blue tack or putty that they can squish, maybe a TheraBand that they can stretch. The little girl at the top there is sitting on a wobble cushion, which is just giving a bit of movement and a bit of vestibular, sort of unbalancing stimulation. There's all sorts of fidget toys that are much quieter than fidget spinners, which are horrible. But there are some quiet things like tangle toys. Or even teaching your child to do chair press-ups. I certainly can't demonstrate, but where they put their hands down either side on the edge of their seat and push their whole body up off the chair. That can just give them a lot of muscular stimulation and help to kind of reset them. And then this is not something for the classroom, but kids with ADHD, it's extraordinary. If you get them to lie down and you roll a ball over them, really push hard, just roll it all over them, again, that will give them a big boost to their concentration. So that's perhaps something that you can try when they're doing their homework. So that's hyposensitivity. Okay, next slide, please. So other kinds of sensory input for hyposensitive children, visual things. So being able to look at something calming or soothing, like a lava lamp, or something rhythmic, or listening to music as well, can really help. Again, my own son, when he was doing his Nat 5 maths, he found it really hard to concentrate. But when the teacher let him listen to music through headphones at school, he was then able to focus on his work a lot better. It feels a bit counterintuitive, but it does work. Okay, next slide, please. Brilliant. So on the other hand, kids with ADHD at times can be hypersensitive. In other words, they get really overwhelmed by all the senses coming at them, and they need an opportunity to calm down and to chill. This is particularly true of kids who've also got autism, but it can be true of any well, it could be true of almost anybody, to be honest, but it can also be true for kids with ADHD. So schools can do things here as well. So for example, getting rid of things that are particularly triggering, like sometimes well, smelly aftershave. Hopefully that isn't the teacher, actually. That might be some uncle. But flickering lights can be really, really triggering for some hypersensitive people. Or they may be hypersensitive to certain textures, so they don't like particular food textures, or they don't like hard waistbands in trousers, say, or things that are part of the school uniform. So you can often swap things. So for example, swapping hard waistbands for an elasticated waistband, or swapping shoelaces for Velcro if that's easier, or using things like ear defenders to drown out noise, or even having a calming tent or a calming kind of nurture area. And lots of primary schools and some secondary schools are doing this. They've created nurture bases where people can go and just chill out with minimal sensory input. So all of these things are just great. Okay, and this is just the last one I was going to show you. So one thing I've found working with a lot of parents of kids with ADHD is there is a tendency to, when the kids get into trouble, which they do, to kind of want to go up to the school and have a big confrontation and say, this is not fair. My child has ADHD. You know, it's not their fault that they did X, Y, Z that they did. And I quite like this cartoon from Gary Larson. I'll just give you a second to read it. But these two brothers, the Anderson brothers, are playing with this baby bear, and the mummy bear's coming over the hill. And the caption is, and no one ever heard from the Anderson brothers again. What this is saying really is, you know, there are consequences sometimes, unfortunately, and ADHD is definitely a reason why there are behavioural problems at school, but kids also need to be aware that it's not an excuse, because at some point they will be out there in the real world. So if things go catastrophically wrong, they have to learn from it, as hard as that is. Okay. So just finally, there's some really good books around for teachers on ADHD. It's perhaps a bit cheeky to suggest to teachers what books they should be reading, but depending on what relationship you've got with your child's teachers, you could make a suggestion. So these are just three that are good, and there are also lots of handouts and sheets and things that teachers can just download for free as well. We have one on our ADHD Glasgow website, which anyone can just download and print off and take along to a parent's evening, just explaining what ADHD is and some of the classroom strategies. So I hope that's been useful.
Really useful, thank you. I hope everyone else found that as useful. It's all a good reminder for me as well, even though I'm on the helpline, and I've heard you speak about this before, Geraldine, but it's always really helpful to come back to and remind us. And we'll send a follow-up email following this webinar, which will have a link to those kind of 2 sheets for teachers that you can pass on to your child's school as well. So we'll include them and when we follow up. But thank you, Geraldine, for that. So I suppose here we've had that the foundation of kind of Beth covering, you know, your child has a right to support, you have a right to be listened to, and your child has that right to be listened to communicate that they need support and that they don't need a diagnosis to be entitled to support. This is about kind of your child's individual needs and that conversation. So, you know, often the key way that starts is with, you know, hopefully being able to work with the school. And firstly, one of the kind of main things to start with, we always say, and I think Geraldine's already kind of touched upon, is that, you know, remember, you're one of the experts on your child, and actually what's going on at home, the strategies you're using at home are really valuable to the school and the teacher when they're coming into school each day. And you and your child absolutely have a right to be listened to in decisions and in planning their support. You know, that's where the kind of foundation of working together comes from, you know, and what we often talk about is that starting with preparing for meetings. So I know it can feel like sometimes the school launch a meeting on you, or you've become something sort of taken over that's meant that it feels like now we really need a meeting. But what we often talk about on the helpline is that kind of preparation for meetings, and the fact that, you know, you and your child have a right to be heard and listened to. So, you know, step 1, if you're going into a meeting with the school, is actually kind of writing, preparing what you would like to discuss, speaking to your child as well. You know, do they want to come along to the meeting? Do they want to record their views? There is also advocacy services out there, so that foundation of you arriving kind of preparing for that meeting with the school, and even sometimes it might be quite helpful even to email them in advance to say what you would like to discuss, so that, you know, you're taking some of that control of the meeting, and also you're not blindsided and the school aren't blindsided. It's often a really kind of helpful foundation to say, these are the sort of things we'd like to discuss. You'll find on our website, on many of the pages where it kind of mentions a specific issue, there will be some suggested issues that you can share, that you can add to those questions, you know, ways to ask for things. And I've just seen, as someone said, you know, you have a right to bring a supporter along to the school as well. That can be a friend, family member, or advocate, as does your child. And that's often a really helpful way to kind of, if you are feeling worried about meeting, to have someone there that's there for you, to prompt you to take notes. The other kind of core things we talk about with the meetings is remembering you absolutely can clarify if you don't understand anything in a meeting, and if you don't understand or you just don't know the acronyms. You know, Beth and I work on the helpline, and we find we're forever hear of a new way that someone's talking about a group or a meeting. You know, there's so many different, you know, whether it's a GERFIC or a GERFME plan. You know, the core is that these should be meetings that are for you and your child, so you working together and both understanding what happens and what is happening, so that you can really share it and be part of that conversation. And one of the kind of other things that we often discuss is you absolutely can ask for meetings of minutes of meetings, or if you're, you know, schools are incredibly busy. So one of the other things that if you're feeling like minutes of meetings aren't happening, is even kind of following up any meeting that you have with an email saying, you know, thanks very much for this meeting. These are the things I've understood. These are the timescales. To start, you know, just start that working relationship and continue that with the school, so that you know where you stand in the school day, and hopefully you're sort of building that way of working together. I know there's been lots of helpful comments in the chat. I'll pass on. So as we've said, kind of that starting with the foundation of starting with having a meeting with your child's school, The other thing that kind of Beth touched upon already is that all children's learning should be planned, and that can take lots of different forms. So, you know, if things are going okay, it might be that that's a kind of informal chat that you and the school are having, or, you know, you and the class teacher have, you know, what's going on and how things are working. But you can, if things are getting trickier, asking for a written support plan to give you that foundation of, can we sit down and talk about what are my child's needs? How do the school feel they're being met? How do you feel they're being met? How does your child feel they're being met? And what's the goals of that support? And often that can be really helpful way of, you know, focusing down on your child's needs. You know, for example, some of the things that Geraldine's mentioned, you know, they're hypersensitive to this, or this is happening. What's some realistic support that could be provided for that need? You know, they're struggling to focus in class. So rather than getting kind of too tied up in, you know, that's something that maybe you feel is a solution, like for example, one-to-one, you could be saying, well, you know, I can see they're struggling with focus. What are the different ways that we can figure out as a school, and the teachers have for helping your child focus? And it might be that the conclusion is a bit more one-to-one time is helpful, but there also might be a lot of other solutions. So if you're coming in with that, how can we work together, and how can we talk kind of what their needs, and, you know, the school and the local authority's duty is to meet their needs. So what are they proposing to meet those needs? That's kind of, you know, the first steps that we often recommend, even if things have been rumbling on for a while. You know, for example, it's the start of a new term, still got a bit of time, you know, for the next year is now the time where you can review any plans that are in place and see if you can make some targets for the end of summer to kind of keep track of how things are working. And when things get beyond that, you know, so, you know, having a meeting, asking for a written support plan, the step above that we often suggest is kind of putting those things in writing, you know, setting out what you're concerned about, setting out, you know, asking the school kind of the key questions you have. How do you feel you're meeting the child's needs? What other support, what more different support could we offer? And could you offer them? Have you considered these routes? You know, here's some information from the Scottish ADHD Coalition about things that work for other children. Can we try some of these? Do we need to involve educational psychology? You know, asking those key questions, but in writing. So you've got a bit of a written record. And also kind of moving up the school, that might be to the head of additional support or the lead person for additional support. That's normally sometimes a deputy head teacher who sort of oversees. And then beyond that, you could also put that to the head teacher. And then you always, as we've mentioned, you know, these duties actually fall to the local authority. So if things aren't working with the school, you know, your child's at that school every day. So if you can move things forward with the school, that's always where we recommend starting. But you can also go directly to your local authority and say, you know, firstly, that can start as just things are not working well at school. Can I get some more advice and your input? And there is also options to kind of take things further. There is making a formal complaint. There's also a mediation process where someone independent can help with moving things forward and speaking to the school. So there are various different steps along the journey. We have some resources, I think, that Mohit will share, and you'll find on our website on kind of working together, that set out the kind of step-by-step ways where hopefully at every stage we can find a way forward, but there are kind of further and further steps you can take. And we have your kind of local authority contact details on our website and things like that, if you do feel the need that you need to take things further. And that's where also you can kind of speak to us on helping. Is there anything you want to add there, Beth? I feel like I've been speaking for a wee while.
Yeah, no, I think you covered it really well. I think, yeah, it's really all about maintaining that relationship as best you can. And like Hannah said, the school are the people that are doing that support on the ground. So, you know, the relationship you have with them is really important. There are things you can do if that relationship is broken down, or you wanting to take those next steps. But with so many of these things, it can be best, as far as you can, to keep it with the school, to talk to the class teacher, to talk to the person responsible for support, to talk to the head teacher if you need to, and maintaining that communication as well. You know, I think it's quite easy for conversations to always happen when something's going wrong, but if something's going really well, that can be a really great way to build that relationship too, to say, oh, I noticed that we've started to give them a bit more you know, a bit more of a brain break in between lessons at the moment, and they're loving it and they seem much happier when they come home, or thanks so much for letting them use their headphones, seems to be really helping, all those kind of things. But yeah, like we say, there are those points of escalation that you can contact your local authority if you need to, and there are further steps beyond that as well. We've got a page called Solving Problems with Your Child's School that sets out step by step what those steps that are on there, and then a couple more as well, and then there's more formal routes as well if you do need to take that further step. So that brings us to the end of the sort of advice giving overview, and now we're going to look more specifically at some of the questions that we hear about on the helpline quite often from parents and families or supporters working with people with children that have ADHD. So one of the ones we hear about quite often is, my child doesn't have a diagnosis yet, but they're showing signs of ADHD, or, you know, they've got siblings with ADHD, or as a parent, I know that I have symptoms like this as well, so I think they seem to be showing signs. What can I do? So Hannah, if someone was on the helpline and they came to you with that, what would you advise them to do? What would you say?
So I suppose, as we've already kind of mentioned, probably the first foundation thing to know is that your child doesn't need a diagnosis to be entitled to support. And I think we all know that there are waiting times and, you know, long waiting times for waiting for a diagnosis. And, you know, obviously that might give more support in other areas, but in terms of education, there, you know, it is worth always remembering that you don't need to be waiting for a diagnosis to be entitled to support for your child. If they're struggling at the moment, you know, if we can recognise some things are to do with ADHD, maybe some things are other things that can be supported with, they're all part of your child's additional support needs. So firstly, it's known you absolutely have the right to go and say things aren't working, what support can we put in place, and feel confident that, you know, if your child needs additional support, they have additional support needs. That isn't something that needs to be proved. It's just if they need more or different support at school to get the most from their learning, that's exactly what they have a right to. What we kind of tend to suggest is, again, it's kind of, you know, starting with meeting back with the school, having conversation about, you know, what are they finding difficult at school, what's going well, what's helping at home, how can we put a plan in place that's recognizing, you know, these are the needs that we understand at the moment. Yeah, we might get more information in the future and we're on this pathway, perhaps, or we're waiting for CAMS, but what can the school do right now? And, you know, the key thing is they have a duty to identify your child's needs. That's not the same as a duty to diagnose them. So there is also steps that the school can be taking and the council can be taking to try and identify and understand, even if there is kind of a waiting list, or we're not sure exactly, you know, what's going on for your child. You know, do educational psychology to get involved, or can the school speak to them? Is there other services or areas of expertise that can work to understand how to support your child? And can we kind of put a plan together based on that? And absolutely, you can also, you know, the resources that Geraldine shared, things like that. You know, there's no reason why you can't be looking at information around ADHD and seeing if those strategies work for your child at the moment, because the law doesn't say this is what support's required for a child with these needs. And in a way that can be frustrating, but it also doesn't mean that there should be flexibility. Is there anything either of you want to add there, Beth or Geraldine?
No, I think you covered that well. I think, yeah, it's like you say, you don't need a diagnosis. It's about what those needs are. And that can include identifying them. You know, having that diagnosis can be really helpful in understanding what a young person's needs are. But while you're waiting for that, or in the meantime, or even if you don't ever get a diagnosis, if that's, you know, if it's not something you're pursuing, or there's a big long wait list that you're waiting for, if those needs are showing themselves at school, whether that means that they have ADHD or not, if they're struggling to focus in class, that's something they need support with. So yeah, it's about having that conversation, and like you say, pursuing assessment for those needs at the same time is something you can definitely do.
And you have a right to request an assessment. So you also find, for example, educational psychology or general assessment of your child's needs, and that's a formal right you have as a parent. And actually also young people aged 12 to 15 can do it as well. So you'll find a section on our website on identifying needs. And that is another route you can take if you feel there's a kind of lack of understanding of your child's needs. Before I noticed you'd unmuted, Geraldine, was there anything you wanted to add before we went on to the
Sorry,
next
no,
slide?
not on that one. That's good.
No worries. So the next question I was going to pose to you, Beth, was I'm being asked to pick my child up from school early. Schools say they can't manage their behaviour. This is something we hear about on the helpline from families, and I imagine some of you may have experienced either not being asked to, not being told your child's excluded, but just that they're overwhelmed, or that everyone needs a bit of a cooling off period. And when you get that type of call on the helpline, what would be your advice there, Beth?
Yeah, so I think the most important thing to know right off the bat is that schools can't send a child home unless they're being excluded. Other than, I suppose, if they weren't feeling very well and they needed to go home for that reason. But if a school is saying to you, your child needs to leave the school grounds, we can't look after them, they can only really do that if it's an exclusion. So it can be helpful to ask if that's what's happening. If you're being asked to pick up your child, asking, is this a formal exclusion? If they're being sent home, it is a formal exclusion, and with that in mind, they have to follow exclusion procedures. There's a page on our website about exclusions that sets out what those are. But one of the most important things to note is that exclusion should be a last resort. All children can be excluded. Schools have the right to exclude pupils, but they also have to make sure that they are meeting the duties they have under additional support for learning legislation and equalities laws as well, in terms of not discriminating against pupils because of their needs. So if it's the case that your child's being asked to leave school because of their behaviours that might be related to ADHD or another condition, or just their additional support needs that are undiagnosed, it's important to talk to the school about that. I think it's quite common parlance now that all behaviour is communication. So if your child is displaying behaviours that are causing them to be sent home, why is that happening? And it's having that conversation with the school. How did this behaviour come about in the first place? What set it off? What was the trigger for that? Why might they be doing that? If they are kicking off in the classroom or making a lot of noise or shouting and screaming or hurting other pupils or whatever the behavior is that's obviously having a negative impact in the school environment, where did that come from, and what can we do about that? So what is the behavior, and where did it come from? How can we in the future prevent that from happening or support them better so that it doesn't happen? Having that conversation with school, like we've said already, is about building that relationship with them, talking about what you recognise works at home, listening to your child and what they have to say. Quite often children know exactly why they behaved that way or why they felt that way, and then they behaved that way. You know, if it's the case that they were really scared, or they were really angry, or they were really upset that they couldn't do something, or they didn't feel included, having that conversation with your child and then advocating for them, or providing a space where your child can express that themselves, can be really helpful for them building a plan that's going to address those specific things. So as Geraldine said, you know, if it's sensory needs, what can they do about that in the classroom so that you don't get to that point of escalation in the future? Because yeah, exclusion should be avoided as much as possible, and those support plans should be in place. Is there anything you would add to that, Hannah or Geraldine?
No, I think it's just maybe I think you've already mentioned, you though, there is, you know, the key thing we normally start with is just kind of going back, clarifying, is this an exclusion? Has the exclusion process been followed? Because the kind of key thing is there's that it should be a last resort, and that your child's well-being, and if your child's considered to have a disability, also their disability considered in that process before the exclusion happens. And I know it can feel a bit extreme to say, almost we're saying, you know, ask the school if your child's being excluded, because sometimes it can feel a bit like a favour that they're saying, oh, we're not going to exclude, I'll just send them home. But actually it's because all these rights come, and exclusion is a serious issue, you know, that's recorded, and that kind of gives you the right to appeal, and it gives you kind of rights to ask those further questions. That it is quite important to question you. It's like, well, you know, exclusion is a serious issue and is a sign that your child needs more or different support. So, you know, actually asking the question can be quite important. Geraldine, do you want to add in there?
Well, I suppose it was an additional question, because I think as well as this type of thing, other things that we see that are kind of linked. One is kids with ADHD not being allowed to go on school trips because they're too disruptive, whatever. So they get told, you're not coming on the trip, you'll be staying at home, or I guess staying at school, but that's horrible. Or another thing is parents being told, can you come in and sit with your child, either in the classroom or maybe somewhere like a photocopier cupboard, even I've heard, and you know, sit and do work with your child because they need supervision and we can't provide it. So is that similar? Is that a similar answer to those, would you say?
Yeah, I think it's very similar in terms of, you know, all children in Scotland have got a right to be involved in school and the school environment and all those opportunities. And as with any need, there needs to be some way of supporting children to do that. Things like school trips, as far as possible, everybody should be involved in that in a way that's going to work for them. Schools obviously have to keep people safe, but that planning should be as part of that process. If they're going to plan a school trip for that class, then they need to think about the needs of the whole class and how they can make that work for them. Similarly, you know, children have the right to be included. We didn't really have the time to get into it today, but the Getting It Right for Every Child GERFEC framework that is all about well-being. One of those indicators is included. If you're not comfortable in the classroom environment itself, then you might not feel included in your class. And if you're being asked to leave or you're sitting out in a different space all the time, that's not inclusion. So it's having that conversation. And it might be that, you know, children do need a bit of time out, a bit of their own space, and there's a balance to be struck. And again, you know, it's all about the child's individual needs and finding the best way forward. I think there's also, we shouldn't really avoid the practical sense that sometimes a child or their parent wants to be involved at the beginning and it's a helpful thing to do, or they're really distressed and they do want to go home, and you know they can do that if they want and if parents want to do that. But long term it needs to be, why is this happening at the moment? What can we do to move away from this? Because a parent shouldn't have to be at school. You know, the school are responsible for their education. But building that relationship means that you can have those conversations and say, I understand why you want me to come in. My son feels comfortable because, you know, I'm speaking quietly, we're sitting together, we're taking our time. How can we build this into his school day without me needing to be there as the parent? You know, how can we phase this out so that eventually he can go off to school or she can go off to school and have the best time without me, and I can stay out of the way.
I think they're both very much tied, particularly the kind of school trips question. I think Geraldine has kind of Beth touched upon. That's actually, if anyone is having kind of issues around that, I think that's one that's particularly can be powerful to talk about, the Equality Act. So we mostly talk about the additional support for learning laws, but if your child has a disability, there's also a duty to make sure under Equality Act that they don't experience discrimination and that reasonable adjustments are made. And with there's actually the guidance around the Equality Act, it has examples of school trips in it, so it can be quite a powerful one to use, because it, you know, it's kind of key, that thing is the school should be planning in advance. If they have a child with ADHD, you know, they need to think really seriously about, if we are not going to make have a class trip, you know, this class trip isn't accessible to this child and it causes them to be excluded, you know, is that discriminatory? Is that, you know, is there not a reasonable adjustment that we can be making in that circumstance? And I think that also kind of ties to kind of parents being asked to come in and come into school. And I know there's one of the parents on the comments has mentioned that as well, being kind of asked to come in. I think one of the kind of key things with that is that exactly, it's not a long-term solution. Every other child has the right, that, you know, is able to go into school and get support that meets their needs. And, you know, it's about their fulfilling their potential. You know, it might be a temporary solution, but, you know, actually children have a right, you know, everyone else is getting to go into school by themselves without mum and dad. So why is that happening regularly for this young person? Is often kind of the thing to revisit. I hope that's useful and answers some of that questions. Geraldine,
Yeah, I'm a little conscious of time, so we've got a couple of other questions that we've prepared. I think the next one we'll kind of skim over quite quickly because it relates to what we've just been talking about being asked to pick children up from school. So this one is about struggling to attend school or being on a part-time timetable. Really, our advice in this situation boils down to, again, the very basics. Your child's got the right to an education and they've got the right to support. Part-time timetables can be a helpful way of meeting that need, but it should never be the long-term solution. So as with any time out of school, having that conversation about how can we support them to return to school? What do they need to be at school and feel comfortable? and then building that back up. So sometimes it might be the case that they're part-time for the short term, and then the plan will be to, you know, reintroduce them into the full school day when they're ready to and when they're able to. But yeah, your child has the rights to an education. So if they're not going to be at school, the other question is, how are you going to support their learning for the time when they're not at school as well?
We have and Mohit shared that, but just to say anyone kind of catching up, there is we have a quite in detailed page on our website that, because this is a regular question we get, which really talks, it covers your rights and your rights, your child's rights and next steps. So it's kind of a key issue we're aware of, but there's some really clear advice there as well, given we've not been able to fully get into it today.
Yeah, similarly with the last question, we wanted to acknowledge that it's happening all over the UK at the moment, and across the world. I think that there's a shortage of ADHD medication for lots of people in lots of places. Obviously, we are not medical professionals, so definitely talk to your GP if it's something that you're struggling to get access to. But what we would say from an education perspective is it's really important to let the school know what's going on. If your child isn't going to be on their medication like they usually are, the school should know that and what that's going to mean for them. So what needs are going to change, and what extra support might they need, what different support. Keeping the school informed and in touch just means that relationship is there, there's open communication, and the school aren't going to be surprised, you know, if your child is needing more support for the moment while this is hopefully resolved.
Yeah, and I suppose that's the thing to know, is like support should always be kept under review anyway. So this is really, you know, there's the practical things that are obviously going on at home, but in terms of at school, you know, or your child has a right to an education still, and basically it's about their support needs, is whether it's temporary or long term, is having some sort of change. So support should be reflected in that and kind of keeping them up to date. The same when it comes to sort of looking at exams and reasonable adjustments for any exams, you know, it's about kind of communicating that with the school so that they can kind of pass that on if there is kind of exam adjustments that are needed to kind of plan ahead for them, but also just to be aware that, you know, if things do change, that's kind of part of their reasonable adjustment duty, and working that out kind of together. But it isn't well, we had this in place and now that can't happen.
Yeah. So we asked you a question at the very beginning, and we'd like to ask you it again now. So hopefully we will see the results of this too. So having heard from Geraldine and from myself and Hannah, how confident do you feel now in your understanding of your child's rights to support at school? Hannah's going to pop up in front of you.
That should be coming up.
We've got one final slide after this one, once you've filled in your poll, that's going to have some more of our contact details again, and a little scanning QR code that we'd love you to fill in. It's got a more detailed survey just about the session, whether it was helpful to you, what we could do differently in the future, or what worked really well, so that we can keep offering this kind of thing for parents and carers. And yeah, knowing what we do well or what we don't is really, really helpful. So if you could take the time to do it, we would really, really appreciate it.
Yeah, so we've got a good amount of people come back saying they're very confident or confident now. A few people are still not feeling not very confident. You know, please do fill in our survey and feedback form. You know, we want to make these as beneficial as possible for everyone. So please let us know what we can improve or how we can do things better. You know, it's one or two people, but still it's really helpful to know, because we want this to work for as many of you as possible. And if there is some specific question that we haven't managed to cover, you know, you can get in touch with us via the helpline. It's sometimes quite busy the day after a webinar, but you know, there is different ways of contacting us through email, and there's lots of kind of resources and advice on our website. I'm also really conscious, I can see there was a wee question about lunch times. We can pop an answer, we'll pop an answer to that in the follow-up email, because we haven't had time to cover. But thank you very much to everyone for attending. I don't know if we have, is there a final slide?
Yeah, there's a final slide that's got our details on, and it's got the email for, or the website for Scottish ADHD Coalition. Geraldine, I don't know if you want to put the Glasgow specific website in there as well. But yes, we will be sending links to the PDFs. What we'll do is we'll send links to our website for all the pages that we've mentioned. We'll send you a little link to the survey form as well. We'd really appreciate if you'd fill that in, and a link to sign up to the newsletter and all that kind of stuff. But thank you so much for coming, and thanks again, Geraldine, for all your time and all your support, and all your wonderful advice as well.
Thank you very much, everyone. I hope you have a good rest of your evening.